Some doors don't announce themselves. They just stay open. And one day, you walk through without remembering when you stopped knocking. Relax and immerse yourself in a love story. The window above his kitchen sink had no curtains. Hermione noticed this first, before the ache in her shoulders from a pillow that wasn't hers, before the particular quality of his silence, before anything else that morning demanded to be noticed. Just the bare glass, pale with early light, and beyond it a slice of London sky, the colour of old pewter. No curtains, as though he'd never expected anyone to stay long enough to want them. She stood at the sink in her wrinkled blouse. She'd found it on the floor near the bedroom door, which was its own kind of information, and filled a glass with water she didn't particularly want. Her wand was on the counter. His was somewhere she couldn't see, which meant he was still in the other room, which meant she had perhaps another 4 minutes before this became a conversation she wasn't ready to have. The water was cold. She drank it anyway. Behind her, the flat was the kind of quietly expensive that never announced itself. No clutter, no photographs on the walls. A single shelf of books whose spines she'd catalogued at 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. Mostly potions theory, 2 volumes of wizarding lore, 1 very worn copy of something in French she hadn't been able to make out in the dark. The furniture was pale grey and precise. Everything sat exactly where it had been placed and gave no indication of ever having been moved. It looked like a room that had been arranged to suggest a person rather than actually contain one. She set the glass down. The floorboard behind her, the third one from the hallway she'd already learned its particular creak, shifted under weight. She didn't turn around. "There's coffee," Draco said. His voice had the careful flatness of a man who had rehearsed neutral. "If you want it." "I'm fine." A pause. She heard him cross to the other side of the kitchen, not toward her, around her, to the cabinet above the stove. The deliberate geometry of it. 2 people in a small room, maintaining exact distances like opposing charges in a field. "You don't have to leave immediately." He said it to the cabinet. She heard the soft knock of porcelain on wood. "If that's what you're planning." Hermione turned then, because not turning would have meant something, and she was done letting her silences mean things she hadn't chosen. He was in a grey shirt, darker at the collar, and his hair was still disordered from sleep, an unguarded detail that she suspected he was aware of and had decided, for reasons she couldn't pass, not to correct. He was looking at the mug in his hand, not at her. "I have work," she said. "I have a 9 o'clock. It's 6:30. I know what time it is, Draco." He looked up then, just briefly, a flicker, grey eyes catching the window light before they steadied back into something more managed. But she'd seen it. She was, professionally and by nature, very good at seeing things people would prefer she didn't. Something in his expression, in that half second before he composed it, had looked almost like a question. She reached for her wand and turned it once between her fingers. An old habit, the smoothed wood, the familiar grain, the way it settled her thoughts when everything else refused to. "I'm not," she started, and then stopped, because she didn't know how to finish the sentence in a way that was both true and survivable. "I'm not angry." True. "I'm not confused." Absolutely not. I'm not going to make this into something you have to manage. That one she could say if she said it correctly. I'm not asking you to explain anything, she finished instead. Draco set the mug down without having poured anything into it. I'm aware, he said. And there was something in the word aware that carried more weight than it should have. Something clipped and controlled. And underneath it, if she pressed, if she was being honest with herself at 6:30 in his curtainless kitchen, something that sounded a great deal like relief used as armor. She didn't press. She picked up her bag from the chair by the door. She'd put it there last night, not thinking, and the specific domesticity of the placement now struck her somewhere soft and undefended, and she slung it over her shoulder and looked at him one more time. He was still standing by the stove, still not quite looking at her. His arms were loose at his sides, which she'd learned over the course of a night and a morning was his version of open. That those long fingers, relaxed and motionless, were not indifference, but a kind of offering he didn't know how to name. She knew this about him, and she wished, very much, that she didn't. "Thank you for the water," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something drier, more interior than that, like a word thought and then swallowed. "Granger." She had her hand on the door. "Take the flu." He said it to the middle distance, his gaze fixed somewhere just past her shoulder. "It's raining." She hadn't known it was raining. She glanced at the window, at that bare, pale glass. And yes, there it was, the diagonal drag of rain across the pewter sky, soft and steady and entirely indifferent to the particular difficulty of this moment. She hadn't known. He had looked at some point this morning before she was awake at the sky. And he had remembered. The flue was lit before she reached it. She didn't know when he'd done that either. She stepped through without looking back, because looking back would have meant something. And she was still, she told herself, in control of what her silences meant. The ministry atrium at 7 in the morning had the specific quality of a place that existed only to be passed through. Hermione stood in the green-tinged aftermath of flue travel and let the familiar clamour of it settle around her. The distant clatter of early arrivals, the soft whoosh of interdepartmental memos overhead, the smell of cleaning solution and old stone, and 100 brewing cups of tea. Her sleeve was crooked. She straightened it. Then she straightened it again, because the first time hadn't been quite right, and she required at least one thing this morning to be exactly as it should be. She walked toward the lifts with her shoulders set and her robes in order, and her expression precisely calibrated to the expression of a woman who had slept adequately in her own bed and had not spent the previous night in the flat of a man who'd lit her flue without being asked. She was very good at calibrated expressions. She'd had years of practice, at school, in the war, in the long aftermath of the war when everyone was still looking at everyone else for signs of damage. She knew how to carry things quietly, how to fold them small and tuck them somewhere internal and functional and continue. The lift doors opened. She stepped in. She thought about the mug he'd set down, the way his arms had hung at his sides, the single shelf of books, the French title she hadn't been able to read. She thought about the rain she hadn't known was falling and the flue that had been lit before she asked. The lift descended and she stared at the brass doors, and she thought, This is going to be a problem. Not because it had been a mistake. She was honest enough with herself, even at 7 in the morning in the ministry lift with her sleeve freshly straightened, to admit that she wasn't entirely certain it had been a mistake. But because it had been real, in the specific way that his flat was real, not performed, not particularly comfortable, not arranged for her benefit. Just true. And truth, in her experience, was considerably harder to recover from than error. Errors could be corrected. True things simply were. The lift reached her floor. The doors opened. She walked out into the corridor that smelled of parchment and old spells and someone's very early breakfast. And she did not think about the curtainless window or the rain or the flu. She thought about her 9 o'clock. She thought about her 9 o'clock for approximately 40 minutes, which was, she decided, a reasonable performance. 3 weeks passed. They were not easy weeks, but they were functional ones, which Hermione had long ago learned to value above comfort. She worked. She ate. She met Jinny for lunch on a Tuesday and successfully talked about everything except the thing Jinny kept almost asking about, deflecting with such smooth precision that she felt a flicker of something uncomfortably close to guilt. She reorganized her bookshelves on a Wednesday evening, not because they needed it, but because the physical logic of alphabetization was soothing in a way that had nothing to do with him, and she was allowed to reorganize her shelves for entirely her own reasons. She did not check her enchanted notepad for messages. She checked it twice a day, which she told herself was habit. On the 19th day, at 10:20 in the evening, a single line appeared on the notepad's upper left corner, in handwriting that was narrow and controlled and slightly right-leaning, as though each letter had been constructed with care and then pulled, at the last moment, towards something it was trying not to reach. I've been thinking about the translation, the French one, if you were curious. She sat very still on her sofa. The notepad lay open on the cushion beside her. She looked at it for a long time, at those 11 words, which were not "come back," and not "I want to see you," and not anything, really, that could be pointed to as declaration. They were simply words about a book, an offer, a door held open at an angle that allowed her to pretend, if she needed to, that it was not a door at all. She picked up her quill. She set it down. She picked it up again. "What's it called?" she wrote. The reply came in under a minute, which meant he had been waiting. "Come and I'll show you." Her chest did something she declined to catalogue. Outside her window, London was doing what London did in November. A low grey persistence, rain that couldn't quite commit to being rain, the amber blur of streetlights against wet pavement. She looked at it for a moment, at the reflections, at her own faint ghost in the glass, quill still in hand, expression not quite calibrated. She thought about the curtainless window, the mug he hadn't filled, his arms loose at his sides, which she now understood to be an offering he had no other language for. She thought about what it meant that he had waited 19 days and then chosen a book. She wrote back, "Give me 20 minutes." And then she sat on her sofa in the amber-grey London evening and told herself she was going because she was genuinely curious about the French title, which was, she acknowledged, pulling on her coat, almost completely untrue. And she was going anyway, and she was allowed to go anyway, and the distinction between what was wise and what was necessary had been blurring at the edges for 19 days now, and she was tired of standing at that particular border, pretending she hadn't already chosen a side. She took the flu. When she stepped out into his flat, the window above the kitchen sink was bare and dark with rain, and he was standing near the bookshelf with the French title already in his hand. And he looked at her the way he'd looked at her that morning, that fraction of a second before composure. And this time, she looked back. Neither of them said anything. He held out the book. She crossed the room and took it, and their fingers overlapped on the spine for a moment. The cool press of his hand, the faint edge of a ring against her knuckle, and neither of them moved. The rain continued against the bare glass. She did not look down at the book. She had read the first page 3 times. Not because it was difficult. Her French was adequate, had been adequate since 4th year when she'd spent 2 weeks of summer holiday working through a Beaubaton grammar text with the focused intensity she applied to everything that mattered. But because Draco was sitting across from her in the grey chair by the window, and every time she reached the bottom of the page, her attention migrated without her permission to the way he held his own book. He wasn't reading either. She was fairly certain of that. The flat was quieter than she remembered, or perhaps she remembered it differently now. In the 3 weeks since that first morning, she had reconstructed it in her mind with the particular editorial tendency she had toward things she was trying to understand, smoothing its edges, making it more legible. The real thing was less legible. The real thing had small specific details that her memory had softened. The slight asymmetry of the bookshelf, one end higher than the other by perhaps a centimetre. The lamp on the side table that cast light slightly too warm for reading, a amber that turned everything it touched a shade more intimate than intended. The faint smell of something herbal, not quite tea, not quite potion work, something in between, that she hadn't catalogued the first time because she'd had other things to catalogue. She turned a page she hadn't finished. "Your French is better than you're letting on," Draco said, without looking up. She kept her eyes on the text. "I haven't said anything about my French. You haven't turned a page in 11 minutes. The specific number. She felt it land somewhere precise and inconvenient. "I'm a slow reader," she said. The sound he made was not quite a laugh. Shorter than that. A single exhale through the nose that carried, if she was reading it correctly, something warmer than amusement. A kind of involuntary acknowledgement, quickly reclaimed. She turned another page. This one she actually read. A passage about a woman standing at a window, watching the Seine in winter, describing the way frozen things still moved underneath, still carried their slow, cold weight toward the sea. She read it twice deliberately, and the second time it meant something different than the first. "It's about a woman who keeps returning to the same city," Draco said. He was still looking at his own book, or performing the act of looking at it. "Even though the city has changed, after something happened there." Hermione lowered her copy slightly. "That's not quite what it's about. No. It's about what she tells herself she's returning for." She paused. "The city is incidental. A beat." The rain made its soft, persistent argument against the glass. "That's one reading," he said. "It's the correct one." He looked up then, fully, Not the fractional glance of that first morning, but a direct, considered look that lasted long enough to be a choice. His expression had that quality she was learning to recognize. The surface, composed, precise, everything below it doing something considerably less composed. "You've read it before," he said. Not an accusation. A realization, quiet and arriving late. She had. 7th year in the hours between patrols, in the particular dark of the Hogwarts library when she'd been using books the way some people used breathing, as proof that the world still contained things that made sense. She'd found it on a shelf in the restricted section, filed incorrectly among the divination texts, which had seemed at the time like the sort of accident that wasn't. She hadn't told him this. She wasn't sure, yet what telling him things cost. "A long time ago," she said, which was true, and was also a form of deflection she was not proud of. He held her gaze for another moment, that grey, assessing look that she suspected saw considerably more than he ever acknowledged seeing. And then he returned to his book, or to the performance of his book. She went back to her page. The lamp made everything amber. The rain continued. Somewhere in the building above them, someone walked across a floor in shoes that needed replacing, and the sound came through the ceiling at intervals, irregular and oddly grounding, a reminder that the world outside this specific circle of warmth and lamplight continued to exist and function and make its ordinary noise. She had not intended to stay this long. She had told herself, clearly and with conviction in the flu, to come, to see the book, to satisfy what she'd identified as genuine intellectual curiosity, and to leave by 11. It was now 20 to 12. She had not left. She was sitting in his grey chair with her shoes off. She couldn't remember removing them, couldn't identify the moment that had felt natural. And the book open in her lap, and the amber lamp making everything look like something from before. She thought, "I should go." She thought, "I'm not going." She thought, "The problem is that I know exactly what this is, and I am doing it anyway, and I don't, if I'm honest with myself in the amber light at 20 to midnight, entirely want to stop." "You're doing it again," Draco said. She blinked. "Doing what?" "The thing where you think very loudly." He turned a page, a real one this time, she thought, though she couldn't be certain. "I can practically hear the footnotes." "I don't think in footnotes." "You absolutely think in footnotes." He paused. "Sub-clauses at minimum." She opened her mouth to object on principle, and then closed it, because the objection would have been dishonest, and they both knew it and the specific quality of his almost amusement, that careful, restrained thing, did not deserve to be answered with a lie. "What's the author's name?" she asked instead. "Lemaire." He said it without looking up. "Celeste Lemaire. She wrote 4 others, but this is the only one that was ever translated, and badly. The English version loses the..." He stopped, turned the page back, as though checking something. "There's a word she uses, apartenance. It doesn't have an English equivalent. The translator used belonging, but that's not it. Belonging implies possession. Apartenance is more like recognition, the state of being recognized by a place." Hermione was very still. "The state of being recognized," she repeated. "By a place," he said. And then, after a fractional hesitation that she felt rather than saw, "or a thing." The concept extends. She looked at the page in her lap, at the French word she now found immediately 3 lines from the bottom: Apartenance, small and exact, and quietly doing an enormous amount of work. She understood suddenly why he had sent for her tonight, and it was not about the book. Or it was about the book, but the book was the most articulate thing available to him, and what he was actually doing, what those 11 words on the notepad had actually meant, was this word, this untranslatable thing. She should not have understood that so clearly. The clarity of it sat in her chest like something warm and slightly too heavy to be entirely comfortable. "Draco," she said. He turned another page. His jaw was set, she noticed. Not tightly, not with any visible tension, but set, held, like a door that was closed but not quite locked. "There's tea," he said, "if you want it." It was the same offer as that first morning. The same syntax, almost exactly. The deflection dressed as hospitality. The "if you want it," that meant please stay in a language she was only just beginning to have a dictionary for. She looked at him for a long moment, at the set of his jaw, the careful angle of his gaze toward the page, the particular stillness of his hands, which were not, she now knew, indifference. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He got up. She watched him cross to the kitchen, the same deliberate geometry as that first morning, but different in texture now, less careful, the distance between them not maintained with quite the same precision as before. He filled the kettle without magic, which surprised her, set it on the hob, reached for 2 mugs from the cabinet above the stove, and this time he didn't put them down empty. She turned to the page with the word Apartenance and read the passage around it properly. The woman in the book returns to Paris in February. She has told herself she is returning for the light, the specific winter light off the Seine that she has dreamed about in other cities. This is not untrue. But the passage makes clear, in Lemaire's careful, patient way, that what she is really returning to is the version of herself that existed before the city meant what it now means. She wants to be recognized by it. She wants the city to know her as she was. It doesn't, of course. Cities don't do that. The stone remembers nothing. The river is indifferent. The light falls exactly as it would have fallen had she never stood beneath it. But she stays anyway, and the passage ends with her at a window, watching the frozen river move beneath its surface, and the last line is simply Elle est restée. Elle ne savait pas encore pourquoi. She stayed. She didn't know yet why. Hermione stared at that line for a long time. Behind her, the kettle began to murmur, a low building sound, not yet boiling, not yet committed. "How did you find it?" she asked. "The book." A pause from the kitchen, the sound of a drawer opening, the small click of a spoon. "It was my mother's." His voice was even, practiced even. She had a shelf of French novels. She spoke it, speaks it, better than most native speakers. She used to read them in the afternoons when my father was... He stopped. She heard the spoon set down. When she had the afternoons to herself. Hermione said nothing. She understood with the particular precision of someone who had spent years learning to read the space around a sentence that this was more than he had intended to give, that he had started the explanation, and the explanation had taken him somewhere he hadn't planned to go, and rather than cut it off, he had simply stopped, left the unfinished edge there, visible. She didn't fill it. She had learned these past weeks that some silences were not problems to be solved. The kettle boiled. He came back with 2 mugs, plain white, nothing decorative, and set hers on the small table beside her chair and returned to his own seat with the economy of movement she'd catalogued that first morning. He sat. He picked up his book. She wrapped both hands around the mug. It was the right temperature. Not scalding, not careful. Just right. She wondered if he'd done that deliberately, and suspected he had, and tucked the suspicion somewhere interior and very warm. They read, or they held books and occupied the same amber-lit space, and occasionally one of them turned a page. The rain continued its soft persuasion against the glass. The building above made its intermittent ceiling noises. The lamp turned everything the colour of something that had already happened. At some point, she couldn't have said precisely when, time having taken on the particular elastic quality of evenings that don't want to end. She looked up from her page and found him already looking at her. He didn't look away. She felt her pulse register the fact without her permission. Not a lurch, nothing dramatic, but a slight quickening, a shift in atmospheric pressure, as though the room had exhaled and was deciding whether to breathe back in. "You came," he said. It was quiet. More quiet than his careful voice usually was. It was also not about the book. She held his gaze. "I was curious." "About the book?" "Yes." He looked at her. She looked at him. The lamp made shadows of his cheekbones, made his eyes difficult to read, which was possibly why he'd chosen that chair. "And now?" he said. The question was small, and it contained, she understood, with the part of her that had been reading him all evening, something he would not ask more directly. Not yet. Perhaps not for a long time yet. He was, at his core, a man who had learned to want things quietly and expect them to be taken away, and the combination had made him very careful with the act of asking. She looked down at her mug, at the reflection of the lamp in the dark surface of the tea. Amber within amber, warm thing inside warm thing. "I'm still here," she said. She heard him exhale, just slightly. Just enough. She turned back to her page, and he turned back to his, and the rain made its patient sound against the glass, and the lamp held them both in its imprecise amber, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. She didn't leave at midnight. She didn't think about leaving at all. She started noticing the pattern on a Thursday. Not the pattern between them. She had already catalogued that with uncomfortable clarity, filed it under things I understand and am proceeding with anyway. But the specific rhythm of his reaching, the way it never came when she might have expected it. Not after a good day, not in any moment that could be mistaken for impulse. It came always after silence. After the particular kind of quiet that had weight to it, that pressed against the edges of an evening with the specific density of something unresolved. She noticed this on a Thursday, because it was a Thursday when the third message arrived. She was at her desk in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, 40 minutes past the end of her shift, surrounded by case parchments she'd been reorganizing for the past hour, with the focused energy of a woman who was absolutely not waiting for anything. The enchanted notepad was in her bag. She was not thinking about the enchanted notepad. The warmth that moved through the leather of her bag, a faint pulse, like a caught breath, was so subtle she almost missed it. She didn't miss it. She reached into the bag without looking, which meant she'd known exactly where it was, which meant she'd been aware of it all evening in the peripheral, patient way she was aware of things she was pretending not to monitor. The handwriting, as always, was narrow and right-leaning and controlled. The Lemaire has a second volume. I found it this afternoon. You were right about the first one. It isn't about the city. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly, the way she'd read that first page in his flat. Not because the words were difficult, but because the space between them required attention. You were right. 3 words that cost him something. She understood that about Draco Malfoy by now, that admission for him was not a small thing, that saying you were right was not the same as it was for most people. For most people, it was courtesy or concession or the conversational lubricant of being agreeable. For him, it was closer to exposure. The careful surface of him, maintained with such consistency, had a specific texture where it thinned. And it thinned, she was finding, around true things. Around moments where pretense would require more effort than he was willing to spend. She picked up her quill, set it down, stood up instead, and put on her coat, and packed her bag with the methodical attention she gave to tasks she was using as containers for thoughts she wasn't ready to think directly. She was not going to his flat. She walked out of the ministry and into the November street and stood in the particular cold of a Thursday evening in London. That specific chill that came up from the pavement rather than down from the sky, that found the gap between collar and scarf with the precision of something that had been looking. And she looked at the amber blur of the street lamps on the wet stone and thought, with great clarity and absolutely no surprise, I am going to his flat. She took the flue from the public entrance on the Strand. He opened the door before she knocked. She wasn't certain how to account for this. Whether he'd heard her in the flue network, whether he'd been waiting, whether some other mechanism she didn't want to examine too closely had made him aware of her approach. She catalogued it and filed it and said nothing about it, because saying something about it would require him to explain it. And she was beginning to understand that requiring explanations from Draco Malfoy was a way of making him retreat into the careful architecture of his composure. And she preferred him. She admitted this, standing in the doorway with the cold still on her coat, slightly less composed than that. He looked at her the way he always did at the beginning of these evenings. That first fractional second of something unguarded before the rest of him arrived and settled the expression into something more manageable. She was learning to read those seconds. They were, she suspected, more honest than anything he was likely to say for at least the next hour. "You didn't write back," he said. He stepped aside to let her in. I came instead. She moved past him into the flat, and the warmth of it met her, that ambient heat of a room that had been occupied for hours, that specific closeness that was different from the cold geometry of the first morning. He'd been here, working, probably, or doing whatever the hours between his days contained. The lamp was already on. The books were already out. He'd been expecting her. "The second volume," she said, setting her bag on the chair and unwinding her scarf with fingers that were still cold from the street. "Where is it?" He crossed to the shelf, the asymmetrical one, and retrieved a slim book with a pale green spine. he held it out. She took it, and their fingers overlapped again on the cover, that same cool press, and this time neither of them pretended to be looking at the book. "You could have told me it existed weeks ago," she said. She kept her voice even. "I only found it this afternoon." "You could have found it weeks ago." A pause. The rain. There was always rain, London being London and November being November, made its soft argument outside. He withdrew his hand from the book. She held it. "Yes," he said, simply, without the defensive architecture she might have expected. She looked at him. He looked back. The lamp was amber and the flat was warm, and he was standing close enough that she could see the precise line of his jaw, the way the muscle there was neither tight nor loose, but held. That careful, specific held that was becoming a kind of private language between them. Draco. She said his name the way she'd been saying it for weeks now, since she'd realized that using it had a particular effect on the careful surface of him. A slight shift, almost imperceptible, like the way a door that isn't quite latched moves in a draft. "I know," he said. "You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say that this is a pattern." His voice was even, measured, but his hands, she noticed, had found the position she'd catalogued, loose at his sides, fingers slightly open. "That I reach and then wait and then reach again, that the intervals are deliberate." She let the silence sit for a moment. "Are they?" she asked. "Deliberate?" He looked at her steadily. "Not in the way you might mean." "Then in what way?" Another pause. He turned slightly toward the window, not away from her, not the retreat she'd learned to watch for, but a sideways movement, a looking at the same rain they'd both been looking at for weeks now from their separate windows. "When I was at school," he started, and then stopped, recalibrated. "There were things I wanted that I understood, early, I wasn't supposed to want. And the management of that, the not wanting, the deciding not to want, became a kind of habit." He paused. "Habits are persistent." She was very still. This was more than the book, more than the word apartenance, and more than "you were right." This was something that had been stored longer, something that had acquired the specific density of a thing carried for years in a confined space. "What did you want?" she asked, quietly, as though volume might disturb it. He turned back from the window. His expression was doing that thing she'd seen only a handful of times. The careful surface not quite managing to contain what was underneath it. The way very fine china shows the light through it when held up, translucent in the places where it's thinnest. "That's a longer conversation," he said. His voice was low and not quite steady, or steady in the particular way of something that is working at steadiness, rather than simply being it. "I have time," she said. "I know you do." He looked at her. "I don't. I'm not." He stopped. His right hand moved slightly, the fingers drawing together and releasing. "I'm not good at this. At saying things that—" Another stop. He looked almost frustrated, though the frustration was turned inward, at himself, at the inadequacy of his own vocabulary for whatever this was. She waited. She was very good at waiting, when waiting was the right thing. "I think about the evenings," he said finally. "When you're here, and when you're not here, I think about them differently, and the difference is—" He exhaled. "Significant." The word landed in the room like something placed very carefully on a surface that might not hold weight. Significant. his word for it. The most he could give, she understood, and also, underneath it, in the thin, translucent places, considerably more than the word itself. She set the green book down on the table beside her. "The intervals," she said, keeping her voice careful, keeping the warmth in it measured, because too much warmth too quickly made him retreat. And she did not, she realized with a clarity that sat low in her sternum, want him to retreat. The waiting between one evening and the next, is that the habit, the not wanting? He looked at her for a long, specific moment. "It's the part of the habit," he said slowly, "that I'm finding most difficult to maintain." She breathed. Outside, the rain intensified briefly, a sudden percussion against the glass, as though the weather had been building to something and had finally decided to commit. The lamp flickered just slightly and then steadied. The flat felt, in the amber aftermath, smaller than before, not uncomfortably, the way a space feels smaller when two people have both stopped pretending they are farther apart than they are. "Then don't," she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that had the quality of a thing long expected arriving before the preparation was complete. "Granger, I'm not asking you to." She stopped, chose her words with the care she gave to things that mattered. "I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give. I'm just saying that the maintenance—" She gestured slightly, a small motion that encompassed the careful distances, the intervals, the deliberate geometry of it all. "It's costing you something. I can see it, and I don't need you to protect me from the cost." His jaw tightened, that fine, almost invisible tension, and then deliberately released. "You don't know what the cost is," he said. "I know it's not nothing." "No." His voice was very quiet. "It's not nothing." They stood in the amber room with the rain at the window, and all the things that hadn't been said fully arranged between them like furniture. Not blocking the space, but occupying it, defining it, making it into something with shape and dimension. She picked the green book back up, turned it over in her hands, read the back cover, another woman, another city, the same Lemaire patience, and set it under her arm. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make the tea." He blinked. A very small blink, quickly recovered, but she caught it. The fractional disruption of his composure at the inversion, at her stepping into the kitchen space, his kitchen space, the one domestic territory he'd consistently held. She moved past him toward the kettle. She heard him, after a moment, sit. She filled the kettle without magic, as he had done that second evening, and she'd wondered then if it was habit or preference or something else entirely, and set it on the hob and reached for the mugs on the shelf above the stove. They were where she expected them. She knew where they were. The realization of that, of how completely she had memorized this kitchen she'd stood in 3 times, moved through her quietly and settled somewhere permanent. She heard him pick up the green book from the table. She heard him open it. She stood at his stove and listened to the kettle build toward boiling, and looked at the bare dark window above the sink and thought, "I know where his mugs are. I know which floorboard creaks. I know that his arms hang loose when he's trying to be open, and that he lights the flue before I ask. And that significant means considerably more than significant. I know these things. I am not, she thought, going to be able to pretend otherwise much longer. The kettle boiled. She poured. Behind her, she heard him turn a page, and then another, and then he made a sound, almost involuntary, low and interested, the sound of someone encountering a sentence that had surprised them. "What?" she said. The first line. His voice had shifted, not entirely, but measurably, the way a room shifts when a window is opened. Less held, more present. "Come and read it." She picked up both mugs and turned and walked back into the amber room and sat, not in her usual chair, but on the near end of the sofa, close enough that when he turned the book so she could see the page, his shoulder was an inch from hers, and neither of them moved away. She read the first line. Il ne savait pas encore que revenir était déjà une réponse. He didn't know yet that returning was already an answer. The room was very quiet. She stared at the line for a long time, and she was aware, precisely, completely aware, of his shoulder an inch from hers and his breathing, and the amber light and the rain, and she thought, yes, exactly that. Returning is already an answer. She had returned 3 times. She already knew what that meant. She reached for her tea and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the lamp held them in its warm imprecision, and outside the rain continued its long, patient argument, and the space between their shoulders stayed exactly as it was. An inch, just an inch, the most honest distance in the room. She left her scarf. Not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately, which was perhaps the more honest accounting of it. She'd unwound it at the door and set it on the arm of the chair, and somewhere between the second cup of tea and the moment she'd realized it was past 1 in the morning and gathered herself to leave, it had slipped behind the cushion, and she hadn't noticed until she was already through the flue and standing in her own flat with the cold of the flue travel still on her skin, and the specific awareness of an absence that hadn't been there before. She stood in her sitting room and looked at where the scarf wasn't. Then she went to bed and told herself she would retrieve it next time, which was, she acknowledged, pulling the blanket up in the dark, already an assumption of a next time, which was its own kind of answer. She thought about the French line for 4 days. Il ne savait pas encore que revenir était déjà une réponse. She thought about it in the lift at the ministry. She thought about it while making coffee in the morning, watching the dark liquid rise in the press with the slightly abstracted focus of someone whose attention is somewhere else entirely. She thought about it on Saturday when Jinny came round for lunch and talked about the new Quidditch season with the bright, particular energy she deployed when she was giving Hermione space to not talk about something, which meant Jinny had noticed something, which meant Hermione's calibration was slipping. She thought about it most, though, on Sunday evening, sitting at her desk with a case file open in front of her and a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, when she realized she had read the same paragraph 4 consecutive times and retained nothing from it except the word returning, which was not in the paragraph. She put her quill down. She looked at the notepad in the corner of the desk. She kept it on her desk now, not in her bag, a small migration she hadn't consciously decided upon. It was blank, had been blank for 4 days. She picked up the quill, put it down again. She was not, she told herself with the firm clarity she reserved for things she was about to do anyway, going to be the one who reached first. Not because of pride. She had examined the question with the same rigour she applied to everything, and concluded that pride was not, in fact, the operative mechanism. It was something more structural than that, something to do with the specific architecture of him, the way the careful surface of him had been built over something that had been, at some point, hurt in ways she was only beginning to understand the shape of. If she reached too readily, too easily, she worried she would teach him that he didn't have to. That reaching could be outsourced, that the habit of not wanting could continue undisturbed because she would compensate for it. She did not want to compensate for it. She wanted him to want things, openly, without the management. She picked up her case file and read it properly. At 9:20, the notepad warmed. She looked at it. The handwriting appeared slowly this time, which she'd learned meant he was choosing the words carefully, weighing them, discarding drafts she would never see. There's something to be said about a woman who argues with a novel. I've been thinking about your reading of the first volume. The woman doesn't return for recognition. She returns because leaving was the wrong answer, and she knows it, and the city is simply where she goes to know it properly. Hermione stared at this for a long time. Then she wrote, "That's what I said." His reply came fast, faster than usual, which registered. "You said she returned for what she'd told herself she was returning for. That's about self-deception. I'm talking about something else." "What are you talking about?" A pause, longer than his previous pauses. She watched the notepad. "Knowing you've made a wrong turning and going back to the exact place where you made it. Not for recognition, not for what was there before. Just to stand in it again and know it differently." She was very still. She read it again. The handwriting was the same narrow, controlled, right-leaning script, but something in the pressure of it was different, slightly heavier, as though the quill had been held more firmly or more carefully, or both. She wrote, "That sounds like penance. Maybe it starts as penance," he wrote back. "Maybe it becomes something else." She set the quill down and looked at the sitting room around her, at the bookshelves she'd reorganized, at the lamp she preferred to the overhead light, at the window with the curtains she'd chosen 3 years ago in a shop on Portobello Road, because the colour reminded her of winter afternoons, and she'd wanted to come home to winter afternoons. She looked at all the deliberate, accumulated choices of her own space and felt them, in this moment, as a kind of distance. She picked up the quill. What does it become? The pause this time was the longest yet. She watched the notepad with the particular quality of attention that she usually reserved for things she was trying not to need the answer to. His handwriting appeared, one word at a time, with the specific slowness of something being said for the first time. "I don't know yet. I'm still standing in it." She went on Tuesday. He didn't send a message. She simply went, took the flu at 7:30 with her coat still on and her scarf still missing, and arrived in his sitting room to find him at the kitchen table with a case of his own spread around him, sleeves pushed to the elbows, a half-drunk cup of something at his right hand, and the particular absorbed expression of a man who had been working for several hours and had forgotten, in the way of sustained work, to be careful. He looked up when she stepped out of the flue. He didn't look surprised. He looked, and this was new, this specific texture she hadn't catalogued before, relieved. Briefly, immediately controlled, the composure arriving like a hand smoothing a crumpled page. But she'd seen it, underneath the composed surface. Relief, clean and involuntary, the expression of someone who had been waiting for a sound and had finally heard it. "You didn't write," she said. "No." He pushed his chair back slightly, a degree or two, an unconscious adjustment of orientation. "I thought—" He stopped. "I didn't want to reach again." She stood in the flue warmth of the room and looked at him, at the pushed-up sleeves, at the working dishevelment of him, at the way his hands rested on the table beside the case parchments, that loose, particular stillness. "I know," she said. "That's why I came." Something moved through his expression. Not the fractional, unguarded second she was used to. Something slower than that, more considered, like a room-changing quality as light shifts through it over the course of an afternoon. He said, "Granger." Just that. Her name. In the voice that wasn't the careful, measured voice, the lower one, the one that appeared at the end of long evenings and in the space between one sentence and the decision to say another. "I know," she said again, because she did. She knew what the name meant in that voice, in this specific configuration of relief and controlled expression and pushed-up sleeves. She knew, and she was still standing in the room, and she had come without being asked, and she was done, she decided, pretending she didn't know what any of it meant. She took her coat off, hung it on the hook by the door, which she had done before, which still felt each time like a small, precise act of intention. She crossed to the kitchen table and looked at the case spread across it. Potioneering licensing dispute, she could see from the header, dense with regulatory parchment. And she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He watched her do all of this. "I have a 9:30 tomorrow," she said, reaching across for one of the regulatory sheets. "So, I'll need to leave by midnight, but I can look at the secondary statutes if you need them cross-referenced. That section there is incorrectly cited. The 1987 amendment superseded that clause. The case law's been settled for 15 years. A pause. "You can see that from across the table," he said. "I clerked in potioneering regulation for 6 months in 2002. I know that clause." She set the parchment down. "Do you have parchment I can use?" He looked at her for a moment longer, that steady grey look, the one that saw more than it acknowledged. And then he reached to the far end of the table and slid a blank sheet toward her without a word. She took it. They worked. It was different from the evenings with books, more active, the quality of the silence between them less resting and more parallel. Two people occupying the same task space the way they might share a workbench, conscious of each other's presence without being impeded by it. She cross-referenced statutes. She heard him scratching corrections onto his parchment, heard him occasionally exhale through his nose in that short particular way that meant he'd found something wrong and was deciding how wrong it was. Once, reaching for the inkwell at the same time, their hands crossed above the table, the side of his hand against the back of hers, a brief, warm pressure neither of them had planned. He pulled back first. She did not look up from her parchment, but the contact registered in her pulse with an accuracy that had nothing to do with accident. At some point, he got up and made tea and set her mug at her elbow without interrupting her reading, and she said, "Thank you," without looking up, and heard him settle back into his chair and return to his work, and the specific ordinariness of it. The tea, the thank you, the seamless return to work, sat in her chest as something considerably less ordinary. Around 11, she set down her quill. The 1987 amendment cross-reference is in the third footnote now, she said. It should hold. He looked at her work across the table. He was quiet for a moment, reading it, she knew, with the full attention he gave to things he considered seriously, which she'd noticed he applied to considerably more things than he let on. Yes, he said. Yes. Thank you. She nodded, gathered the parchment, squared the edges, set it back on his side of the table. In the tidying, in that small habitual neatness, she became aware of him watching her. Not the working glance of two people sharing a table, but watching. The sustained and particular attention of someone who has decided to look at something properly and is doing so. She kept squaring the parchment edges. You came without being asked, he said. Yes, you've done that before. Once. She set the parchment down. This is the second time. He was quiet. She could hear him thinking, or she could hear the quality of his silence that accompanied thought, the specific density of it, the way it had texture rather than simply being the absence of sound. Why? He asked. The question was careful, and it was also, underneath the careful, something much less composed. Something that wanted the answer with a directness he couldn't quite let the surface of him express. She looked at him across the table, at the working dishevelment, the pushed sleeves, the case parchments spread around him like a life being conducted in the open, not performed, not arranged for her, just real and present and occupied. She thought about what she could say, the several true things available to her, arranged by degree of exposure. Because you didn't reach, and I wanted to. Because returning is already an answer. Because I know where your mugs are, and which floorboard creaks, and what your silence sounds like when it's full rather than empty. And I am tired of knowing all of that from a careful distance. She said, because the interval was costing you something, and I told you I didn't need you to protect me from the cost. He looked at her. The lamp between them, that amber, imprecise lamp, made the shadows of his face into something she could almost read. That's not entirely why, he said, quietly, precisely. She held his gaze. No, she said, it's not entirely why. The room held its breath. The rain, faithful November rain, moved against the glass. Her mug sat warm between her palms. Across the table, he was very still in the way she now knew meant he was not still at all. That beneath the composed surface, something was moving, adjusting, making decisions she couldn't see but could feel in the changed quality of the air between them. His hand moved across the table. Not reaching, not quite. Placed rather in the space between them, palm down, an offering of geography. She looked at it. She looked at him. She moved her hand across the table and set it over his. Not grasping, just placed, her fingers over his knuckles, warm and deliberate and entirely unhurried. His hand turned, slowly, beneath hers. His fingers found the spaces between hers with a careful, specific attention, as though he was memorizing the arrangement. Neither of them spoke. The lamp burned amber. The rain persisted. The case parchments sat in their neat stack at the table's edge, and the two mugs steamed their slow diminishing warmth, and his thumb moved once across the back of her hand. A single, unhurried stroke, the most restrained and complete thing she thought she had ever felt. And she sat in his kitchen at 11 and thought nothing at all. Just sat, just held, just let the room be what it was, amber and raining, and entirely, quietly real. She told Jinny on a Wednesday. Not everything. Not the notepad or the French novel or the specific quality of his thumb moving across the back of her hand, which was still, 4 days later, the thing she returned to most readily when her attention wasn't firmly directed elsewhere. But enough. The shape of it. A careful outline that left the interior details unlit but made the structure visible. Jinny listened without interrupting, which was unusual and therefore significant. She sat across the table at the small cafe near the ministry where they took lunch on Wednesdays, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't drunk from in several minutes, her expression doing the particular thing it did when she was processing something that required the suspension of her first instinct. When Hermione finished, Jinny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long?" "Since October. It's February. I'm aware of the calendar, Jinny. I'm not..." Jinny set her cup down. "I'm not saying it as a criticism. I'm saying it because 4 months is... That's not nothing. That's a thing that has been happening for 4 months that you haven't told me about, which means it's a thing you've been protecting." Hermione looked at her tea. "I wasn't protecting it." "You protect everything you care about by not talking about it until you've decided what to think." Jinny said this without accusation, with the particular directness of someone who had known her long enough to have mapped her habits. "That's not a flaw. I'm just naming it." Hermione considered this, found it accurate and mildly irritating in the way that accurate things often were. She stopped, started again. "He's not who I expected him to be." "Who did you expect him to be?" "A version of school." She turned her teacup a quarter revolution, a small rotation that served no purpose. The performance of him, the person he used to wear in public. And he's not that. He's careful, she said, but not in the cold way, in the way of someone who has learned that things break if you handle them wrong, so he handles everything slowly, with attention. She paused. "He lit my flue before I asked, the first morning." Jinny looked at her for a moment. "Hermione, I know. You're already... I know." Jinny picked up her tea, drank, set it down with the deliberate calm of someone reorganizing their response. Does he know that you're... We held hands across a table for 40 minutes, and neither of us mentioned it. She heard how this sounded. It wasn't awkward. That's the thing. It was the least awkward thing that's happened between us, which should probably tell me something. "It tells you quite a lot," Jinny said dryly. "It tells me quite a lot," she agreed. Outside the cafe window, February was conducting itself with the grey, determined persistence of a month that had no intention of being anything other than exactly what it was. People moved past on the pavement with their coats pulled close, their breath visible, their attention focused on destinations that were not here. Hermione watched them for a moment. All that purposeful motion, all those people going toward things they'd already decided to go toward, and felt something clarify in her own chest, slow and certain, like a sentence that had been assembling itself for weeks, finally reaching its full stop. "I'm not going to stop," she said. Not to Jinny, exactly. More to the window, to the grey Wednesday outside it. "I've thought about it. I've considered the case for stopping, and it's a reasonable case, and I'm not going to." Jinny's mouth curved at one corner. "I know. I needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't me." "I know that too." Jinny reached across the table and briefly covered her hand. A quick, warm pressure, nothing like the careful 40 minutes of Tuesday evening, but carrying in its way the same message. "I know. I see. Go on." "He'd better be worth the 4 months of watching you pretend you were fine." "He doesn't know I spent 4 months pretending I was fine." "Then tell him." Hermione looked at her. "That is an absolutely terrifying suggestion. Most true things are." Jinny finished her tea. "Let me know when the terrifying thing happens. I'll want details." She didn't tell him that Wednesday, or Thursday. She sat with it the way she sat with difficult texts, turning it over, examining the load-bearing elements, testing where the weight was distributed. What it would mean to say, "I have been navigating toward you for 4 months with full awareness, and I am done pretending the navigation is accidental." What it would do to the careful, amber-lit space they'd built. Whether the saying of it would collapse something or open it. She thought about the first morning, the curtainless window, the flue lit before she asked. She thought about apartenance, recognition, the state of being known by something. On Friday evening, he sent a message that wasn't about books. "Are you all right?" She stared at it. 3 words that cost, she understood, more than they appeared to, because asking "Are you all right?" required the admission that he had been attending closely enough to notice a difference, that he'd been watching the space where her messages came from and registered an alteration in their frequency, that she had become, in some cellular way, something he monitored without deciding to. She wrote back, "Yes," thinking. "About?" She considered her answer for a long moment. "About what I said, that the interval was costing you something. I think I've been creating my own version of the interval, and I don't think I'm doing it for better reasons than yours." The pause that followed was longer than usual. She sat with it, in her sitting room in the February dark, the lamp on, a book open in her lap that she hadn't looked at, and she waited with the particular quality of waiting that had become, over these months, less anxious and more attentive, like listening for a specific sound in a quiet room. What would it mean, he wrote finally, to stop? Her heart did something careful and irreversible. She wrote, "I think you know what it would mean." Another pause. Then, "Come on Saturday, not for the book." She read this 3 times. Not for the book. 5 words from a man who had spent 4 months speaking in borrowed texts and careful intervals, and the oblique grammar of lit flues and tea at exactly the right temperature. 5 words that were, in their way, the most direct thing he had ever said to her. She wrote, "What time? Whenever you want to come. Whenever you want to come." Not a time. Not a constraint. A door held fully open for the first time. No angle, no ambiguity. Just open. She set the notepad down and pressed the backs of her fingers to her mouth and sat very still in her sitting room for a long time. She arrived at 7. Not because 7 was the right time. There was no right time, he'd made that clear. But because she'd managed, through application of the focused will, she usually reserved for closing arguments and complex magical theory to wait until 7. She'd reorganized nothing. She'd read nothing. She'd made and abandoned 3 cups of tea in the 5 hours between his message and the moment she stepped into his flue, and all 3 cups were sitting on her kitchen counter at various stages of cold when she left. He opened the door before she knocked. He was in dark grey, softer fabric than she'd seen him in before, something that looked like it had been worn many times, that had lost the precision of new. His hair was unmanaged. He was not, she registered immediately, wearing the careful surface. Or he was wearing a version of it so reduced, so attenuated by whatever this evening already was, that it was barely present, a transparency over the actual face beneath, which was uncertain, quiet, more open than she'd ever seen it outside of those fractional, unguarded seconds. And unlike those seconds, it didn't correct itself when she looked directly at it. He let her in without speaking. She stepped into the flat and the warmth received her, that occupied warmth, his particular Thursday presence. And she stood for a moment in the sitting room and felt the specific gravity of an evening that both of them had arrived at deliberately. No books on the table. The lamp was on. The kettle was not. He stood a few feet away, and for the first time in all the months of this, the careful geometry between them had no fixed points. No table to work across, no books to hold, no tea to make. Just the room and the lamp, and both of them with nowhere to direct their attention except each other. "I've been thinking," he said. His voice was the low one, the end of evening voice, except it was the beginning. "I know." She turned to face him properly. "So have I." He looked at her. The grey eyes were doing that thing, the thing she'd spent months cataloguing, where they held more than his expression admitted to. But tonight, the gap between the two was narrower. Tonight, what was in his eyes and what was in his face were closer to the same thing than she'd ever seen them. And what they both contained was something she recognized because she had been carrying the same thing for 4 months, in the careful interior space she reserved for truths she wasn't ready to speak. "I'm not good at this," he said. He'd said this before, in this room, weeks ago, but it landed differently now, without the deflection that had followed it then. Tonight, it wasn't prelude to a change of subject. Tonight, it was the subject. "I know," she said. "Neither am I. I'm good at understanding things. That's not the same." He was quiet for a moment. "You understand too much," he said, and there was something in it that wasn't complaint, something closer to the way a person names a quality they've been privately undone by. "Since October, you've understood things I didn't say, given me room, space to be." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "Worse at this than you. You're not worse at it. I've been waiting for you to leave." She absorbed this, the flat simplicity of it, the confession without ornament, without the architecture of deflection. He had been waiting for the point at which her patience resolved into sense, and sense into distance, and she became another person who had seen the careful surface and decided it was all there was. "I know," she said, for the 3rd time, and watched the words reach him, watched the slight change in his face, the easing of something that had been held for a long time. "You knew I was waiting for it, and you came anyway," he said. "I came anyway." "Why?" She looked at him across the quiet room. At the unmanaged hair and the soft grey fabric and the open, uncertain face. And she thought of all the ways she'd tried to answer this question in the past 4 months. In the ministry lift, over reorganized bookshelves, in the amber light of his lamp, across a table with his fingers between hers, and how all of them had been true, and none of them had been complete. Because the first morning, she said carefully, you lit the flue before I asked. He was very still. And I stood in your sitting room and felt it, felt what it meant that you'd thought to do that. And I thought, this is going to be a problem. And I was right. It has been a problem. She paused, but not the kind I meant when I thought it. He was watching her with the full, sustained attention he gave to things he was taking apart to understand. She let him look. She was done managing what her looking back meant. What kind then? He said. Low, intent. The kind, she said, where the problem turns out to be that you've been paying attention to someone for long enough that you can't locate the exact moment you stopped being able to imagine not doing it. The room was very quiet. His expression did the thing she'd been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to see. The surface and the interior arriving at the same place simultaneously, the long-held careful distance between them finally closing. What was in his eyes and what was in his face became the same thing entirely, and what they were was this. Yes, exactly that. That is precisely it. He took a step toward her, just one, measured and deliberate, and entirely without the careful geometry that had defined every step he'd taken near her for 4 months. One step, and then he stopped. And he was close enough now that she could see the slight unevenness of his breathing, and the precise line of tension that ran from his jaw to his shoulder, and was not the controlled tension of composure, but the taut, specific tension of someone holding themselves very still at the edge of something. She looked up at him. She did not step back. His hand came up, slowly, with that careful, specific attention she'd felt across a table and in the overlap of fingers on a book spine. And he tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with a single, unhurried movement, his fingertips barely grazing her cheekbone, and the touch was so restrained and so completely deliberate that she felt it everywhere at once, a current moving from that single point of contact through the whole of her, and she understood that this careful, considered, achingly gentle touch was the most honest thing he knew how to do. She reached up and covered his hand with hers before he could withdraw it, held it against her face. His eyes closed. Just briefly. A second, no more. A second in which the composed surface was entirely gone, and what remained was something undefended and real and very, very tired of being alone inside itself. When he opened them again, he was looking at her with the whole of his attention and none of his armor. Hermione, he said. Her name, her actual name. In the low voice with no careful surface beneath it. She felt it rearrange something permanent inside her chest. Outside, February continued its grey determined work against the glass, and the lamp burned amber. And she stood in his sitting room with his hand against her cheek and thought of nothing at all except this specific gravity, this real and reigning and quietly irreversible now. She stayed. Not the way she'd stayed before, the incremental staying of long evenings that extended past midnight through the slow accumulation of tea and books and paralleled silences. This was different. This was a staying that had been chosen at the door, before either of them had spoken, in the moment she'd stepped into the flat and felt the particular gravity of an evening that was already something other than the evenings that had preceded it. She stayed, and they sat on the sofa, not in their respective chairs with the careful table between them, but on the sofa, close enough that the warmth of him was a continuous presence along her left side. And they talked. This was also different. In all the months of amber evenings and borrowed books and notes in narrow right-leaning script, they had not, she realized, talked. Not like this. They had communicated, with precision, with the oblique grammar of people saying true things in languages that preserve deniability. But talking was something else. Talking was what happened when two people had stopped needing the protection of indirection. He talked about his mother first, not dramatically, not as confession or catharsis, but the way he talked about most things, carefully, with attention to accuracy, choosing words that were precise rather than large. His mother's French novels. The afternoon light in the Wiltshire sitting room where she read them. The specific quality of her silence in those hours. Protective, self-contained, a woman who had learned to build an interior life that existed independently of everything surrounding it. She taught me that, he said, without meaning to, or maybe she meant to. He was looking at the middle distance, at the rain-dark window, his voice the low, even register of someone examining a thing they've carried for a long time. That you could be in a room with people who controlled everything around you and still have something they couldn't reach. Hermione listened without filling the spaces. She had become, over these months, very good at the specific discipline of not filling his spaces. The books were that, she said, when the pause indicated completion rather than hesitation. For her, yes. He looked at her, and then they were mine. She thought about the shelf, the asymmetric shelf with its precise spines, the French title filed incorrectly on the end. She thought about a boy constructing an interior life in a house that hadn't been safe, and the books that had been the architecture of that interior, and the way he still moved toward them when something needed saying that he hadn't yet found words for. The Lemaire, she said. You found it on her shelf. When I was clearing the manor. A brief tightening around his eyes, quickly resolved but visible. After the war. She'd left in a hurry, and there were things she couldn't take. He paused. I was there for weeks, alone mostly, going through rooms. His jaw set and then deliberately released. The French novels were on a shelf in her sitting room. I took them all, but the Lemaire was the only one I read. Because? The first line. He said it without hesitation, which meant he had thought about this before. The French one. Elle est restée. Elle ne savait pas encore pourquoi. She stayed. She didn't know yet why. He was quiet for a moment. I'd been staying in places I didn't know why I was staying in for a long time. It felt like someone had noticed. Hermione looked at him, at the profile of him in the amber light, the composed line of his face, and underneath it the long accumulated weight of a person who had spent years in rooms that weren't safe, and built his interior life with the precision of someone who knew it was all he'd reliably have. You know why now, she said, don't you? He turned to look at her, the grey eyes direct and unguarded in a way that was still, even now, slightly startling, the way it was always slightly startling when a thing you'd known in outline suddenly revealed its full dimension. "I'm beginning to," he said. She looked back at him for a long moment, at the whole undefended face of him, and felt something in her own chest loosen, a tightness she'd been maintaining without quite knowing it, the careful management of her own wanting, the self-imposed restriction of a woman who had understood what this was for months, and had waited, with increasing difficulty, for him to be ready to understand it too. She reached across and tucked her hand into the space between his arm and his side, not grasping, just placing, the way she'd placed her hand over his on the table, with that same deliberate, unhurried intention, and felt him go very still beside her, that absolute stillness of a person receiving something they'd been afraid to want. Then his arm moved, closed around her shoulders. The weight of it was warm and considered, and very slightly uncertain, as though he was still calibrating, still checking with that careful, specific attention that this was real and sanctioned and not going to be taken back. She leaned into it. She felt him exhale. "I've been terrible at this," he said, into the air above her head. "You've been learning," she said. "There's a difference. Not from your end. From my end," she said. "You lit my flue before I asked. Everything else was manageable." He was quiet. She felt the quality of his quiet, the full kind she'd learned its texture by now, and she let it be what it was. Outside, the rain continued its February persistence, and the lamp made everything amber, and his arm was around her shoulders with the careful warmth of something that had crossed, finally, from wanting to being. She told him about the 4 months. Not immediately. It came later, after the quality of the evening had shifted again, after they'd talked about his mother, and then about her parents and the specific aftermath of what she'd done to protect them, which she hadn't told many people about in its full weight. She'd told it practically at the time. "I modified their memories. I sent them to Australia. I restored them after." A sentence that contained in its flat recitation an act of such profound and terrifying love that she'd been unable, in the years since, to look at it directly without something in her chest becoming very complicated. He'd listened to this the way she'd listened to him, without filling, without the reflexive, sympathetic sounds people made when they were managing discomfort. He'd listened with his whole attention, and then he'd said, quietly, "You were 17. "Yes." "And you didn't tell anyone how it cost you?" She was quiet for a moment. "I told myself it was the right thing to do, and that the cost was beside the point." "Yes." His arm tightened fractionally. "I know that particular argument." She looked at the window, at the rain. "The 4 months," she said. "Since October. I want to tell you something about them." She felt him still beside her, not tensing, not the defensive stillness she'd catalogued in those early evenings, but attending, listening. "I understood what was happening very early," she said. "Probably the first morning, actually, at your kitchen sink. I picked up the glass of water and I thought, this is going to be a problem." She paused. "And then I spent 4 months being extremely precise about not examining what kind of problem." "Why?" he said, low. "Because examining it would have required me to admit that I was hoping for a particular outcome." She felt him listening. And hoping for a particular outcome felt dangerous, because the outcome required you to... She stopped, found the accurate word. "Arrive. At it. On your own terms. and I didn't know if you would." He was very still. "So, I waited," she said, "and I came when you reached, and I tried to give you room, the way you said, space to be worse at this than me." She turned her head to look at him. "I want you to know it wasn't difficult. The waiting. It wasn't patient resignation. I want you to understand that clearly." She held his gaze. "Every evening in this flat, even the first one, even when we were being most careful with each other, I wanted to be here. There was nowhere I was managing to be. I was just here, because here was where I wanted to be." He looked at her for a long time. The lamp made his eyes difficult to read, and also very easy to read, the way amber light worked, softening everything while simultaneously illuminating it. "4 months, he said. 4 months. And you didn't. You never." He stopped. His brow drew slightly inward, not with frustration, but with the expression she associated with him encountering something he was recalibrating around. "You never pushed." "No. Most people push." He said it without bitterness, observationally, the way he made most assessments. When they've decided they want something, and the other person is... He paused, moving at the pace I was moving. "I know," she considered. "I didn't want to push because I could see you were moving, just carefully." She paused. "And I thought if I pushed, you'd stop." Something crossed his face, a swift and complicated thing, gone before she could name all its components, but leaving in its aftermath a specific quality of expression she hadn't seen before. It was, she thought, what gratitude looked like on someone who had very little practice with being understood. "I would have," he said quietly. "Stopped." "I know. That's..." He exhaled. "That's not fair to you. It's who you are, the version of you I've been learning." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not interested in a version that would have moved faster and been less honest. I'm interested in this one." His jaw moved. She watched him take this in, watched him receive it with the uncertain, careful difficulty of a person who had spent a long time expecting to be found insufficient and was actively revising that expectation in real time. His free hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his side. Not in the deliberate hand covering of the kitchen table, something less formal than that, less announced. Just his hand finding hers with the ease of something that had been doing it for a long time in some version of this room that existed slightly ahead of where they were. "I was afraid," he said. He said it directly, without qualification. The word afraid, plain and precise, and clearly costing something. "Not of you, of what it would mean if I let this be real, and then it..." He stopped. "And then it what?" she asked. He looked at her. "Ended." The word sat in the room with its full weight. She let it. "I know," she said, for the 4th time, and this time it meant something different than all the previous times. Not "I understand your behavior," or "I recognize the pattern," but something deeper. "I know that fear. I have been carrying the same one. I have been afraid of the same thing from the other side of it." "I know," she said again, quietly. "Draco. So have I." He looked at her, and the carefully maintained distance between the surface and the interior of him, the gap she'd been watching close, incrementally over months, was simply not there. He was looking at her with the whole of himself, no managed space between what he felt and what he showed. And what he showed was, yes, this, here, finally. His forehead dropped to hers. The touch was so gentle and so complete that she stopped breathing for a moment. Just a moment, the space of one caught breath before she let it go and leaned into the contact. His forehead warm against hers, their faces close in the amber light, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath and see the particular way his eyes had closed and the way his expression, with the eyes closed and the surface entirely down, was something she wanted to memorize and carry. Neither of them moved. The rain was a soft constant at the glass. The lamp burned its amber warmth over both of them. His arm was around her shoulders, and his forehead was against hers, and his hand covered her hand, and the room was very quiet in the specific way of rooms where something true has just happened, and the air is still adjusting to contain it. "I'm not going to end," she said softly, "for the record." She felt his hand tighten over hers, felt the small tremor in it, quickly controlled, almost imperceptible, but there. "I know," he said, and the word in his voice was new. Not the flat, measured "I know" of his careful surface, but something without architecture beneath it. Just the words, just the sound, just him saying a true thing in the low, honest voice with his forehead against hers in the amber room. Outside, February continued. The rain found the glass. Somewhere above them, the building made its ordinary noise, that intermittent ceiling reminder of the world persisting beyond this specific warmth. She turned her head slightly, just enough to press her lips to his temple. Soft, brief, the quietest possible thing, and felt him go utterly still, and then felt him breathe. Just breathe. As though he'd been waiting, without knowing it, for permission to do exactly that. The morning came in grey and slow. Not the pewter grey of that first morning. That cold particular light she'd catalogued from his kitchen sink while her heart did its careful arithmetic. And she'd told herself she was in control of what her silences meant. This grey was softer. A February morning grey, the kind that arrived without urgency, that had no argument to make, that simply settled over the city like something that had always been there and was only now being noticed. She woke before him. This, too, was different from the first morning. That morning she had woken in the specific alertness of a person in an unfamiliar space. Every sense forward, cataloguing, the body doing its automatic inventory of where it was and what that meant. This morning she woke slowly, in increments, surfacing through layers of warmth and the particular sound of his breathing, which she had apparently, at some point in the night, learned well enough to find familiar. She lay still and listened to it. The flat was quiet in its particular way, not empty quiet, but contained quiet, the silence of a space that had someone in it who was not making noise rather than a space where no one was. She'd learned the difference over months of these evenings, the specific quality of occupied air, his particular warmth on the left side of her, his breathing slow and even, his arm still loosely across her waist, with the unself-conscious weight of sleep. She looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was plain white plaster, with a faint crack running from the light fitting toward the far wall. She hadn't noticed this before, had never been in a position to notice it, and its ordinariness struck her as extraordinary in the way of things that are only visible from certain angles. The crack was old. The building was old. everything in this flat had the specific density of things that had endured, that had been in their positions through many configurations of light and weather and occupancy. She was aware, with the clear-eyed awareness that came specifically in the quiet before full waking, of what last night had been. Not in the cataloguing way, not with the analytical precision she usually brought to significant events, the instinct to organize and file and cross-reference. Just aware. The way you were aware of a change in air pressure, not through reasoning, but through the whole of the body registering simultaneously that something was different now from what it had been before. He had said, afraid. He had said it plainly and without the softening architecture of deflection, and it had cost him something visible, and he had paid it anyway, and she had said so have I. And they had sat in the amber room with their foreheads together and breathed the same close air, and she had pressed her lips to his temple and felt him exhale like a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it had a name. They had stayed like that for a long time, long enough for the lamp to seem less bright, long enough for the rain to change its rhythm against the glass, shifting from the steady, persuasive rain of earlier to something intermittent, undecided, as though the weather too was adjusting to new conditions. He had said, eventually, into her hair, "Stay." Not "you can stay," or "if you want to stay," or any of the careful conditional constructions he'd used before. Just stay. A single verb, unhedged, offered without the protective grammar of deniability. She had stayed. And now the ceiling had its crack, and the light was grey and soft, and his arm was across her waist. And she was aware, lying very still so as not to wake him, of a happiness so quiet it barely had a name. Not the loud variety, not the kind that announced itself and required witnesses, but the kind that sat in the body like warmth in stone after a day of sun, present everywhere, requiring nothing. He moved beside her, not waking, a shift, a deeper settling, his arm adjusting its weight across her. She heard his breathing change slightly and then resettle into its slow rhythm, and she closed her eyes and let the grey morning continue its unhurried arrival. She thought about the crack in the ceiling. About all the mornings it had been there unremarked, in this room that had been arranged to suggest a person rather than contain one, in this flat with its curtainless windows and its precise pale furniture and its single shelf of books that had been his mother's and then his, and were now, in some small specific way, also hers. She thought, I know where his mugs are. She thought, I know which floorboard creaks and what his silence sounds like when it's full, and how he holds a book he's not reading, and the specific sound of his exhale when something surprises him into honesty. She thought, I know him. Not completely. Not the way you knew a theorem, the way she was used to knowing things, fully, and with the satisfaction of completion. The knowing she had of him was more like knowing a piece of music. Not every note memorized, not the technical anatomy of every measure, but enough. The shape of it, the feeling of it, the way it moved through the body and left something altered in its wake. She opened her eyes. The crack in the ceiling ran from the light fitting to the far wall. Behind her, his breathing shifted again. The quality changed, the particular alteration of sleep moving toward waking, the rhythm losing its perfect evenness and becoming something more irregular, more present. She waited. You're awake, he said. His voice was very low and unfinished with sleep, and nothing like his usual voice, the careful one, the measured one. This was earlier than that, before the composure arrived. "I have been for a while," she said. A pause. His arm, still across her waist, didn't move. "Thinking?" "Looking at the ceiling." She felt him turn his head, presumably toward the ceiling. "There's a crack," he said. "I noticed. I've been meaning to have it seen to." "Don't," she said. "I like it." Silence. Then, with something that wasn't quite amusement, but occupied the same quiet territory. "You like a crack in the plaster." "I like that it's there. That it's been there. That things have a history you can see if you look at the right angle." She paused. "The building is old. 1843. He said it without hesitation, which meant he knew it, had known it, carried the fact the way he carried things he'd found interesting, quietly, without announcement. It was a textile merchant's residence. The bones of it are original. She smiled. She wasn't sure he could see it. She was facing the ceiling rather than him, their configuration not quite aligned for visibility. But she smiled anyway, at the ceiling and the crack in the plaster and the 1843 bones of the building, because of course he knew. Of course he had learned the history of the thing he lived in. Of course he had wanted to understand where he was. 1843, she said. The flue connection was added in 1912. You can see the original installation point if you know where to look. A pause. Above the mantelpiece, there's a slightly different shade in the plaster where they had to reinforce it. She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at the ceiling. His profile was soft in the grey morning light, the composed lines of his face not yet fully arrived, the version of him that existed before the day's first decisions assembled the familiar architecture. His hair was disordered, his eyes tracing the ceiling's geography with the colour of the February sky outside, that particular grey that wasn't flat but layered, that had depth if you looked at it long enough. He turned and found her looking at him. He didn't compose himself. He looked back, morning direct, unguarded, the grey eyes steady on her face with the whole of his attention and none of his management. "Hello," she said. It was a ridiculous thing to say, and she said it anyway. The corner of his mouth moved, that almost smile, the interior one, except this morning it reached further. This morning, it broke the surface entirely, briefly, a real smile, uncontrolled and somewhat startled by itself, as though it had arrived without his permission, and he'd decided, after a fractional deliberation, not to reclaim it. It undid her slightly. She had suspected his real smile might be something to reckon with, and she had been correct. "Hello," he said. The word sat between them in the grey morning air with its full absurd warmth, and neither of them looked away. He made breakfast. She hadn't anticipated this, had assumed, if she'd assumed anything, the pattern of the first morning. The careful offer, the space held between them like a theorem that needed proving. But this morning, he moved through the kitchen with a directness that had nothing careful about it, finding things from the refrigerator, filling the kettle with the same non-magical deliberateness she'd noticed before, setting 2 plates on the counter with the ease of someone who knew without having to think about it that there would be 2 plates this morning. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table they'd worked across last Tuesday, the case parchments gone now, the surface clear, and watched him. "You cook," she said. Not surprised exactly, more as though a piece had found its position and she was registering the click of it. Adequately. He cracked eggs into the pan with a competent single-handed motion. There was a period after the war when I was living elsewhere, without access to house elves. I learned from necessity. Where? A flat in Edinburgh, 17 months. He moved the pan with a slight turn of his wrist, managing the heat without looking directly at it. Small, remarkably cold. The flu connection was unofficial. She folded this into the picture she had of him. The 17 months in Edinburgh, the unofficial flu, the learning to cook from necessity in a cold flat, while the world he'd grown up in reconfigured itself around his absence. Draco Malfoy in Edinburgh, learning to manage eggs. It should have been incongruous. Instead, it was just more of the continuous thread, the accumulation of a person becoming someone he hadn't been before, quietly and without audience. 17 months, she said. What did you do there? Read. A brief pause, the spatula moving. Thought. Another pause. Understood several things I'd been not understanding previously. She watched him plate the eggs with the same focused attention he brought to parchment work. Set the plates on the table. Poured tea. Her mug first, precisely the right shade, which she had not once had to specify, and which she was now certain he'd arrived at through the same careful attention he brought to everything she didn't ask him to notice. He sat across from her. They ate. The morning was quiet around them. The grey light had shifted slightly, warmer now, or the same grey with more intention, moving toward actual day. She could hear the building making its ordinary ceiling sounds above them, the world resuming its Tuesday functions. I looked for you, he said, into his tea, conversationally, in the tone of a person reporting a fact. After the war, not immediately, years after. She looked up, looked for me. You were in the Prophet occasionally, department promotions, the Wizengamot reform piece in 07. He turned the mug between his hands. I read them. She was quiet, absorbing this. Draco Malfoy in an Edinburgh flat, reading ministry announcements in the Prophet, reading about her. You didn't... She stopped. No. His voice was even. I didn't. Why not? He looked up from the mug. The grey eyes were steady and morning honest, and the composure was fully present now. He'd assembled it somewhere between the eggs and the tea, the familiar architecture back in place. But it fit differently this morning. Less like a surface maintained against intrusion, and more like something worn lightly, the way you wore a coat in mild weather. Present, but not necessary. The same reason I waited 3 weeks after October before sending the first note, he said. The same reason the notes were about books. He held her gaze. I needed to know that it wasn't. He stopped, began more precisely. I have wanted things before, and had them be about what I needed, rather than what was true. I wanted to be certain this was different before I... The pause this time was different from his usual pauses. Fuller. Before I made it real for someone else. She looked at him across the table. At the morning light version of him, the plaster crack version, the Edinburgh 17 months version, all the versions she'd been assembling since October, now visible simultaneously, layered, a depth that made the composed surface not a concealment, but a context. And are you, she said, certain? He looked at her steadily. Yes. The word was simple, and it was the most complex thing he'd said. She reached across the table. The same motion, the same deliberate, unhurried placing of her hand, and covered his where it rested around his mug. His fingers turned beneath hers and found their places between hers with the ease of the night before. And she understood that this was already a language they had, already a syntax both of them knew. I looked for you too, she said, in a different way, but I looked. He was very still. For years, she said, I met people who were one thing all the way through, consistent, uncomplicated, good in the ways that were legible. She watched his face. And I kept thinking there was something, that the consistency felt like a surface too, just a different kind. She paused. Like I was looking for the place where the plaster was a different shade, where something real had been put in. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, shifting the morning light of it. And then October happened, she said. October happened, he repeated, quietly. And you lit my flue before I asked. His jaw moved. His fingers tightened between hers. Hermione, he said. Her name in the low voice, the honest voice. And this time it carried everything. The Edinburgh flat and the 17 months, and the books that had been his mother's, and the careful intervals and the word afraid said plainly, and the arm across her waist in the grey morning, and all of it, all of the accumulated true weight of a person who had been, in his particular difficult way, moving toward her for longer than either of them had named. She looked at him. He looked at her. The February morning held them in its grey, unhurried light, and the tea steamed between their joined hands, and the building above made its ordinary noise, and she thought, here, this is what I was looking for, not the legible thing. This. He leaned forward across the table, slowly, with the careful attention she knew now as his particular expression of intention, and she felt the shift in the air between them, the narrowing of the distance that had defined months of amber evenings, the long, slow closing of a space that had always been moving toward this. She didn't move back. His free hand came up to her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with the unhurried precision of something done for the first time, and also, somehow, as though it had been done many times before in some version of this kitchen that ran alongside the one they'd been careful in. She felt her breath change. He was so close now that the grey of his eyes was all she could see clearly, and they were not flat grey, but the layered kind, the kind with depth. And what was in them was the whole of him, the unmanaged, unsurfaced whole of him, looking at her with the complete honesty of someone who has stopped being afraid of being seen. I have been, he said very quietly, wanting to do this since October. She felt the words in the hand against her face, and the space between them that was barely a space anymore, and in her own chest, where something warm and permanent had been building since the morning she'd stood at his sink and understood that this was going to be a problem. Then, she said, and her voice was not quite steady, stop waiting. He kissed her like he did everything, with attention, with a specific, unhurried quality of someone who had decided to do a thing completely or not at all, who had no interest in the partial or the approximate. His hand against her face was warm and steady, and his mouth found hers across the last inch of February morning air, with a sureness that undid the careful breath she'd been holding since October. Since the first morning, if she was honest, since the flu and the pewter sky and the glass of water she hadn't wanted. She kissed him back, not carefully, not with any of the management she'd been applying to herself for months. The calibrated expressions and the straightened sleeves and the precise folding of things into interior spaces where they could be carried without showing. She kissed him back with the full weight of what she'd been navigating toward, and she felt him receive it, felt the shift in him, the further loosening of something that had been held for a very long time, his hand moving from her cheek into her hair with a slow and thorough attention that made the February morning feel like something altogether different from February. The table was between them. The mugs were going cold. Neither of them particularly noticed. When they separated, it was slowly, reluctantly, the way two things disengage when they'd rather not. A breath of space, and then his forehead against hers again, that position she'd felt last night as the most honest thing he'd offered her. And now it meant something additional, something layered over what it had meant before. His eyes were closed. She looked at him, at the morning light version, unguarded and present, the real smile's aftermath still visible in the lines of his face. And she thought, this is what was under all of it. This is what the careful surface was protecting. Not coldness, not the composed indifference she'd spent years of school assigning to that particular face. Something that was almost its opposite. Something that had needed protecting precisely because it was not cold, that had learned to wear distance like armor because what was underneath it had been, once, handled carelessly by people who should have known better. She understood, in this specific moment of his closed eyes and the warmth of his breath against her mouth, that the distance had never been a wall. It had been a door. She just needed to learn the particular quality of his knock. "Draco," she said. He opened his eyes, that direct grey look unwavering, the whole of him present. "I need you to know something," she said. "Tell me." "I'm not going anywhere." She said it plainly, with the same precision she gave to important things. The precision of someone who understood that certain words required exact delivery, or they lost their load-bearing capacity. "I know you've been waiting for the point where I decide the cost is too high. I know that's been operating underneath all of it, underneath the intervals and the careful reaching." She held his gaze. "It's not going to happen. I want you to actually know that, not to receive it politely and file it under things people say. I want you to know it as information." He was very still. "Hermione." "I'm not saying it to reassure you," she said. "I'm saying it because it's true, and you deserve to have true things said to you directly." She paused. "Someone should have been doing that for rather longer than I have." His jaw moved. The muscle there, that fine particular indicator she'd catalogued over months, shifted and then deliberately released. "You've been doing it since October," he said. "Most people don't notice the things you notice." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "That's also information." He looked at her for a long moment, the grey layered eyes doing their seeing. She let him look, let him take the time he needed to take the thing she'd offered and understand it was real, turn it over, test its edges the way he tested everything he wanted to trust. Then he lifted her hand. the one still resting over his on the table, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. A single, deliberate point of warmth against her skin, his eyes on her over the joined line of their hands, and the gesture was so entirely without performance, so quiet and considered and fully meant, that she felt it move through her like a frequency. "All right," he said against her hand, and then, lower, "All right." Not "I believe you," or "thank you," or any of the other available formulations. Just "all right." His particular economy, his way of saying received, true, held. She understood him. They walked later. This surprised her more than the breakfast had. He suggested it without preamble, stood from the table and said, "Come for a walk," with the casual directness that had been appearing more frequently since last night, the new syntax of a person who had stopped pre-translating everything through the filter of what he was allowed to want. She put on her coat. He held it for her, a small automatic gesture, entirely unnarcissistic, the kind of thing done without thinking by someone for whom it was instinct rather than performance. And she felt the warmth of his hands briefly at her shoulders as the coat settled, and she reached up and briefly pressed her palm over one of his hands before he withdrew it, and the whole exchange lasted perhaps 4 seconds and contained more than 4 hours of some conversations she'd had. They went out into the February street. London in February was an exercise in committed greyness, and she had always found it, against all aesthetic logic, rather beautiful. The specific flatness of the sky pressed everything down to human scale. The buildings, the trees with their bare particular skeletons, the people moving along the pavement with their coats and their breath and their purposeful insulation against the cold. Everything was at street level. Everything was visible. He walked beside her, close, not touching initially, the proximity of 2 people who were aware of each other's exact location in space without needing to demonstrate it. She could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder in the cold air. They walked. The street was quiet for a Saturday, the particular quiet of a February morning that hadn't yet decided to be afternoon, when the city was still in the process of assembling itself. Their footsteps were audible on the damp pavement. The rhythm of them fell into sync without effort, without the micro-adjustments of 2 people who hadn't done this before. "Tell me something I don't know," he said. Not a deflection. She'd learned to tell the difference. A genuine request. The kind of thing he said when he wanted to hear her think. She considered. "When I was 8, she said, "I read the complete works of Dickens in 11 days. I was ill with something, nothing serious, and my mother brought a box of books from the library, and there he was." She paused. "I didn't fully understand a great deal of it, but I remember thinking that the world was much larger than I'd understood it to be, and that the largeness was mostly made of how people treated each other." He was quiet for a step or 2. "And now?" "Now, I think the largeness is still mostly that. I've just learned more about the texture of it." She glanced at him. "Tell me something I don't know." He looked at the street ahead. She watched him think, the particular quality of his thinking visible in the slight draw of his brow, the way his gaze moved to the middle distance when he was selecting from among several true things. "I wrote to you," he said, "in 04, after I came back from Edinburgh." He said it to the pavement. "A letter, 4 drafts." A pause. "I didn't send any of them." She absorbed this. 2004. She'd been deep in the Wizengamot reform work, long days in the archives, the particular exhausted momentum of believing in something and working toward it with every available hour. "What did they say?" she asked. "The drafts." The first three said too much. The corner of his mouth moved. The fourth said almost nothing. I decided almost nothing wasn't enough, and too much was worse, and I couldn't find the territory between them. "You found it eventually," she said. "October." He glanced at her. "You made it possible to find it." "I don't think that's—" "You do think that," he said, quietly, without challenge. "You know how you were, giving room, not requiring explanations. The flu, that second evening, you arrived without being asked, and you sat down and looked at the case parchments and said the 1987 amendment superseded that clause and didn't make it into anything except what it was." He paused. I'd been waiting for everything to become something I had to manage. And it didn't. It just was. He turned to look at her. "You just were. And I kept waiting for the performance, and it never arrived." She looked back at him. The February light was doing something specific to his face, flattening the composure, leaving only the actual thing underneath, which was a person who had learned to expect performance from the world and had been, very slowly, finding out that she was not going to provide it. "I'm not very good at performance," she said. "I've tried. It requires not knowing things, and I find not knowing things considerably more uncomfortable than simply being what I am." "I know." He said it warmly, or with the warmth he produced when he wasn't filtering it, which this morning he wasn't. It is, the thing He stopped, chose. The thing I most needed to be around. She felt the cold air on her face and his shoulder at her arm, and the dampness of the London pavement under her boots, and the warmth moving through her chest, like something that had found its correct location after a long time of looking. His hand found hers, not reaching, arriving, the way the word had arrived last night, without conditional syntax. Just his hand finding hers at their sides and taking it with the quiet certainty of something decided. His fingers between hers in the cold air, the press of his palm against hers, the warmth of it immediate and specific in the February chill. She held on. They walked. She thought about the Le Maire. Il ne savait pas encore que revenir était déjà une réponse. He didn't know yet that returning was already an answer. She thought about the woman in the book, returning to Paris in February, looking for the light off the Seine, looking for herself as she had been before the city meant what it now meant. She thought about how the novel ended. She'd finished both volumes over the course of these months, reading them in the evenings in her flat with the lamp on and the notepad beside her, with the woman not finding the version of herself she'd been looking for, finding instead something she hadn't anticipated, not recognition by the city. Recognition of herself as she was now, in this February, in this configuration of loss and return, and continuing, a self that was different from before, and was. The final pages argued with Le Maire's patient precision. Enough. She thought about October, the first morning, the curtainless window. She thought about the crack in the plaster of his ceiling that had been there since 1843, and which she now knew about because she had been looking at the right angle. "I think," she said, that you should get curtains." He looked down at her. That almost look, almost smile. "You said you liked the window." "I like what I can see through it." She looked up at him. "You can have curtains and still have the window, Draco. They're not mutually exclusive." He was quiet for a step, 2 steps. The particular quality of his quiet that she'd learned over months was not silence, but thought. Not absence, but presence. "What colour?" he said finally. She felt the smile arrive before she decided to produce it. "Something warm. You have enough grey." He looked at her. The grey eyes, the layered ones, the kind with depth, doing that thing they did now, which was no longer the careful seeing of someone assessing what was safe to show, but the open, attentive seeing of someone who had decided you were worth the full range of his vision. "You could help me choose," he said. And then, with the careful precision of someone placing something valuable into the open, "If you wanted to come back, to help choose." She understood that this was not about curtains. She understood that if you wanted to come back was not the careful, conditional syntax of before, not the hedging, not the deniable door angle. She understood that it was the new syntax, the one that had arrived last night when he'd said stay without qualification. The if was courtesy rather than uncertainty. He was learning in his particular way to distinguish between the two. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her and turned and looked at her in the February street with the grey London sky above, and the bare trees and the damp pavement, and the other people moving past them with their coats and their Saturday errands, and their complete indifference to 2 people standing still on the pavement in the specific gravity of a moment that was not about curtains at all. She looked up at him. "I'm going to keep coming back," she said. "I want you to understand that as a statement of fact rather than an invitation that requires a response." She paused. "I'm going to keep coming back because this, you, this flat, the crack in the ceiling, and the mugs in the cabinet, and the asymmetric bookshelf, and the Lemaire, and the 4 months of February." She felt his hand tighten around hers. "This is where I want to be, and I'm done applying the interval to that." He looked at her for a long moment, the whole of him present. The surface and the interior arrived at the same place, the same face, the same grey February morning eyes that were not cold, had never been cold, had simply been waiting for someone with the patience to look long enough to see the depth in them. He brought her hand up, still in his, their fingers still interlaced, and held it against his chest. She could feel through her fingers and through the layers of his coat the steady, specific rhythm of him, just present, just real. "Hermione," he said. "Yes," she said, before he finished, before he said whatever the careful or the honest or the new syntax version of it was. Yes, she was already saying yes. He kissed her again. There in the February street, with the grey sky and the bare trees and the strangers moving past. Not like the first time, less of a beginning, more of a continuation, the kind of kiss that knew it was going to happen again. His free hand at her jaw, tilting her face toward his mouth warm against the cold of the morning air, unhurried, thorough, and entirely without the management of distance. She held his hand against her chest. She felt him smile against her mouth, a real one, the uncontrolled kind, the one she'd seen that morning when he'd said hello back to her absurd hello. And she smiled too, which made kissing him briefly logistically complicated, and she didn't mind at all. When they separated, she kept her face close to his. His forehead found hers, that position, that honest position, and they stood in the February street breathing the same cold air. "Come back this evening," he said, against her forehead. Low voice, no architecture underneath it. "Not for the book." "Not for the book," she agreed. "And tomorrow." She felt the warmth move through her entire chest, reaching the places she'd been keeping carefully in the low amber light of his lamp all these months, the ones she hadn't been ready to illuminate until now. "And tomorrow," she said. Above them, the February sky was doing something. Not brightening, not yet, but shifting, moving toward it. The grey acquiring a quality it hadn't had an hour ago, a hint of direction, of the light underneath making its slow intention known. She looked up at it. His thumb moved across her knuckles in that single unhurried stroke, the same as it had been on Tuesday at the kitchen table. The most restrained and complete thing, the sentence in a language made entirely of attention. And she closed her eyes and let the cold morning air and the warmth of his hand and the sound of London resuming its Saturday existence all arrive at once without any attempt to organize or file or make it legible. She just let it be what it was. Warm, raining, lightly now, the faintest possible precipitation. Not quite rain, more the memory of it. The air simply too full to hold everything it had been carrying. His hand around hers. The February street. The sky moving, quietly and without announcement, towards something brighter than grey. She stayed exactly where she was.
This story is not really about Draco and Hermione. It is about something we all know. That feeling when you keep coming back to someone and you tell yourself it is for a reason. The book, the tea, the conversation, but you know the real reason. You just are not ready to say it yet. We all have that person, the one we reach for carefully, the one we write three drafts to, and then send nothing, the one whose silence feels like a language we are slowly learning. Draco never said, "I love you," in this story. He let her flew before she asked it. He remembered it was raining. He tuned his hand under hers so his fingers could find the space between hers. That is how some people love, quietly, through small exact things. And Hermione, she understood him before he understood himself. She gave him room. She did not push. She just kept coming back because she knew that returning is already an answer. I think the most honest love stories are not about grand moments. They are about a crack in the ceiling you only see from a certain angle, about learning where someone keeps their mugs, about the specific sound of their silence when it full raises and empty, about staying, not because someone asked it, but because there is nowhere else you want to be. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope it reminded you of someone.